Hello and welcome to the Negation podcast. I'm David Gauke.
And I'm John Hall.
So just to introduce Negation is an expert advisor in managing negotiations, specifically between public and private sector entities. And the plan in our podcast is to talk a little bit about the strategies and behind-the-scenes mechanics that shape successful negotiations. And our aim is to help those who are involved in negotiations with the public sector to understand the challenges they face and how they might address them to deliver better results in the future. I'm chair of Negotiant. John is one of our associates. My background is as a former Treasury Minister, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, also Financial Secretary and Executive Secretary. I was also Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and also for Justice.
My background is on the other side of Whitehall. I worked as a Deputy Director in Treasury to 4 Chief Secretaries. Unfortunately, David wasn't one of them. I'm in 2 Chancellors, and I was also Director of Strategy at the Department of Health and Social Care to 3 separate Secretaries of State from 2 different political parties.
So what we wanted to do today is set out a little bit of the public spending context. As you've heard, I've been a minister, actually on both sides of the table when it comes to negotiations over spending settlements. John has done that role as an official. And recently we've had the spring statement, which gives us a bit of an indication of what to expect in the spending review in June. And we wanted to talk through what we now know, what are the things to be looking out for, what are the implications for those entities dealing with the public sector over the next few months and years. So, John, to start off, do you want to just set out a little bit of the context of what we've learned from the spring statement in terms of the state of the public finances and what that's going to mean for public spending?
Thanks, David. I think the first thing to say is the spring statement was a statement which Rachel Reeves did not want to make. That she's been very clear she wanted one annual budget, and she wanted that budget last October to set the fiscal framework of tax, public spending and borrowing for the full length of the Parliament. But the Office for Budget Responsibility has got a statutory obligation to update its forecasts twice a year. And the update that they did this month suggested that Rachel Reeves's 10 billion margin for hitting her fiscal rules in 5 years' time had turned into a 5 billion deficit. That's largely because of a slowdown in the economy last year and because interest rates were higher than had been expected. So in a sense, Rachel Reeves was forced to turn a policy event this March from something that she hadn't expected to do. And that does raise some questions for us. Because fiscal rules were originally introduced as a way of signalling to markets that the government actually had a plan. They weren't just going to borrow forever. And also to enable a government to do long-term spending planning so they didn't have to adjust spending and tax every year if there was a downturn in the economy. We've now got into a slightly bizarre situation where the Chancellor is making policy change because of a change in forecast for 5 years' time. And that's a forecast that everybody knows is going to be wrong. So she's got a headroom of 10 billion. The average 5-year forecast error is 5 times that. So we run the risk that not only this fiscal event, but twice a year in the run-up to it, we're going to have endless speculation about tax and spending and micro changes that the Chancellor will be forced to do because of changes in forecast.
There's obviously a bit of a debate at the moment, quite a lot of criticism of the fiscal rules and the OBR being too powerful. But John, this is largely a consequence of Rachel Reeves not giving herself very much headroom back in October, and she's not given herself very much headroom today. So as you say, we may be back in the same place in the autumn again.
I think that's right. We're in a crazy place where, and I know it's very easy to say, a billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money. And 10 billion does sound an awful lot of money, but it's a tiny fraction of public spending, and it's a tiny fraction of the forecast error. The real issue, though, is, because it's very easy to say she should have allowed herself more headroom. Well, to do that, it means she would have needed to announce bigger tax rises in October or to allow a lower growth in public spending. And the underlying reason we're in this problem is that there's an economic growth problem in the UK economy. that prior to the financial crisis in 2007-8, with ups and downs, the economy had broadly been ticking along with productivity growing by about 2% a year for decades. And since then, it's been closer to 0.5%. So fundamentally, this slowdown in the normal rate of growth of the UK economy has created an awful lot of problems. When you add in the financial crisis, the pandemic, and dare I say it, the impact of Brexit, then what we've seen is a massive increase in debt. So back when I started in Treasury, the national debt was less than 40% of our national income. Now it's 100%. And we were shielded from that for a lot of the last decades because interest rates were historically very low. But they've now increased. So we're now spending over 4% of our national income every year just paying interest on the debt. That's double what we were paying just 5 years ago. So this combination of slow growth in the economy, build up in debt, very high levels of debt interest payments, mean that the room for manoeuvre fiscally is just a lot less large than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you look at a situation where taxes are very high by historic standards, a sense that public services are under strain, and yet we are not bringing debt down as a percentage of GDP over the next few years. It's broadly flat, which is in a period of time in which there is no recession forecast, is really unusual. You would expect to be bringing debt down over such a period because there's always something unexpected that you can't have in the forecast that is there. But I guess from the perspective of, if you're dealing with the public sector, there's perhaps not the certainty on spending that you might necessarily expect. If there is a 50-50 chance that Rachel Reeves in the autumn is going to have to do something to tighten the fiscal situation, assuming that she's going to stick by her rules, then that does raise uncertainties as to whether there's going to be further tax increases or further spending cuts. So I think that's something worth bearing in mind. We're going to talk a little bit about the spending review, but as someone who was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, not during a spending review period, you still realise that these spending reviews are very much a process, not just an event. It's not all done there and then in a spending review. There is the chance that things will change subsequently.
I think that's right, David. I mean, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the very strange, you might say, profile of public spending over this Parliament. Rachel Reeves announced very large increases in public spending in October, but almost the big bulk of those happened in the year that's just finishing and the year that's about to start, where spending has grown by 3 to 4% over and above inflation. For the 3 years she's about to make spending announcements for, that's just a little over 1%. So it's not austerity 2.0, and it's broadly grown in line with growth in the economy, but it's not going to feel like a particularly generous period either. And if you take out what we assume is going to happen for health, if health gets its historical average of about 3.6% over and above inflation, if the government sticks to the pledge it's made on increasing defence spending and then keeping that as a share of national income at 2.5%, and if we freeze pupil spending per head with changes in student numbers, then you're actually looking at cuts once inflation's taken into account for other spending departments. And if you stay with the state of public services at the moment, David, I mean, I think almost 1 in 10 local authorities next year has got some special arrangement to try and make the books balance in terms of being able to borrow to fund current spending or whatever. You know yourself issues in the criminal justice system. So we're not going into this spending review with public services on an even keel, and this is going to look very tight. Now, if you combine that with the risk that rather than having 3-year plans laid out and certainty that departments can plan that spending, that actually is a risk that the Chancellor is going to have to claw some of that back, that might have a real impact on what is delivered in public services over the next few years.
Okay, now let's look in a little bit more detail about what the spending review might hold. But also at the same time, I want to come back to those fiscal rules that we have talked about. And one of the rules is to ensure that the current budget is balanced. But that gives you a bit more scope if you're the Treasury to spend more on capital expenditure, on investment. And we're seeing signs of that. John, what do you make of the early signs of this and how this is having an impact on spending decisions?
Yeah, so if I was going to give Rachel Reeves credit for anything, it's that in a time of fiscal constraint, she's actually not just protected, but increased capital spending. And often in the past, governments have tried to manage budget pressures by slashing capital. That happened quite significantly back in the 2010 budget, for example. So going forwards, we see much more generous capital funding for public services. And there's a bit of an issue there with the much heralded announcement that Britain was going to cut its budget on soft power, the DFID budget, and increase its budget on hard power, the defence budget. Because that wasn't really a like-for-like switch. About half the cuts on the DFID budget are capital and about half are revenue. But about 90% of the increase of the defence budget is on capital. And that's a much higher proportion than the proportion of its total budget that the Ministry of Defence spends on capital now. Now, it might be that the thing that defence really needs is drones and planes and guns and warships, and not more soldiers or sailors. Or it might be a sign of what's to come, where departments are going to face a lot of capital available to deliver their spending ambitions, but much less revenue. So you might be starting to see departments looking at, is there a way we can capitalise different levels of spending? In a way, in the past, they often tried to turn procurement into revenue streams because capital was very scarce and there was a bit more revenue knocking around. What's your experience of that, David?
Well, yeah, so certainly if you go back to my time as Justice Secretary, what tended to happen on an annual basis was that we couldn't get the current budget to add up, that the settlement was too tight, that we would have a capital budget, which would very often be, for example, prison building. There'd be delays in getting the money out of the door because these things can take quite a lot of time, planning issues, etc., etc. And so pretty well every year, the way in which the MOJ's finances would be sorted out would be a switch of money from the capital budget into the current budget. And then you'd kind of muddle through. And people will be critical of that and say that's why we haven't built enough prisons and so on and so on. But that is the reality of what happened for some time. It strikes me is if you're going to have a very tight level of headroom, if you like, on your current budget, and you've got a more generous capital budget, that option obviously isn't going to be there. You're not going to be able to do that year by year. So that makes it a little bit more difficult than it might look, that you haven't got as much flexibility. I think there's also an interesting question as to what extent that might distort some decisions. So, not being critical of the choices they're making in defence, but if your argument was, well, actually we wanted more soldiers rather than more drones, well, no, it has to be capital spending. So we're going to build stuff and acquire stuff rather than spend stuff. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. And I think that's something that anyone who is dealing with government over the next few years is going to have to bear in mind, that I think there might be relative austerity when it comes to current spending and relative generosity when it comes to capital spending. So I think that's certainly one to keep a close eye on.
I mean, I think there's a really important issue there because, well, at the national level, it obviously makes sense that we might be much more sanguine about the government borrowing if it's using that to invest in bridges, in railway lines, in roads, things which will deliver benefits for years to come, than if they're shelling out the door on teacher salaries, on nurses' salaries, which you need to pay every year. But at the level of individual public services, this can really screw decisions, because if you've got lots of capital but not much revenue at the micro level, then people will make decisions to buy kit, for example, as opposed to signing a service contract with a private provider, irrespective of which of those procurement routes is the best value for money, which is what we'd ideally like to do them for. If you think back in the day when private finance was the big show in town for getting assets, then it was miraculous that all those value for money tests showed that PFI projects were going to deliver better value for money than building in the public sector. The second aspect of what you say, and we're seeing this already, is governments have always struggled to ramp up capital spending quickly. This government is trying to spend capital quickly. There was quite a significant capital underspend last year. My anticipation is what we will observe is departments coming back to Treasury and saying, you've given us this capital, we've not been able to spend it, but we've got real revenue pressures. Can we convert it, please?
Yeah, and that's going to be harder. There's nothing new about that, but that is going to be harder with the current fiscal rules and the current level of headroom. So one to look out for. John, I wanted to sort of pick up one thing that Rachel Reeves talked about in her spring statement, which is the transformation fund. And this is obviously in the context of wanting to make more use of technology, AI, and so on. It's all very Tony Blair Institute stuff about a transformation fund. And that must be sensible. And there must be opportunities to make use of technology here and to set aside a fund for that purpose. Certainly sounds great. But is it? What's your view, and in particular, given the scale of the challenge and the scale of the fund?
I mean, there's always a question about if you've got a hard-bitten Treasury official that you may get the more sceptical end of the spectrum on this. I think Transformation Fund is the latest in the line of a long bunch of initiatives which I'd loosely label Invest to Save. That the public, politicians, managers look across the public services and see them ripe with inefficiency, both in terms of how they do things and how they target things, whether it's prevention, better prevention to stop better healthcare, or can we get proper IT in so we stop losing medical records, or we can actually get the logistics sorted out. There's a couple of problems in that. In my experience, when people came with Invest to Save initiatives, it always promised upfront. They wanted upfront cash to increase spending now, and they promised me all sorts of good things would happen in the future in terms of lower spending. In practice, that very rarely happened. What I tended to think of a lot of these initiatives, rather than saving money, they were often good value spending. That if I spent £4 on something, actually it would save £1 down the line, so it would only cost me £3. So it was good VFM, but it's very hard to get the cash out. I think there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, we constantly get management consultants in who say we can save lots of money by doing these things. If you look for most public services and what they're saying today, it's exactly the same things as they were saying 20 years ago, and we didn't get those things out. We know in health we can, for example, we can cut the agency nursing bill, we can reduce the need for expensive and distressing emergency medical care by better community care. But it hasn't happened. In fact, all the trends have gone in the opposite direction. The second thing is a lot of this evidence comes from pilot schemes. And I'm a huge fan of pilots. I'm an economist. We like to trial evidence and produce it. Lots of pilots are produced by high-performing teams who are very motivated, really dedicated to changing stuff. And how we roll that out looks a bit different. So we very rarely get the benefits when we roll stuff out that we did originally. And the third aspect is it's very easy to identify savings. You can see efficiency anywhere. What's much harder is the hard grind of getting those out.
I think that's really helpful, John. I'm sort of conscious that this is a podcast aimed at perhaps those entities who deal with the public sector, but I think a few spending ministers and spending departments should be listening to this just to explain why the Treasury is as sceptical as it is. I think one point I was also going to raise in terms of this transformation fund, it's not that big, is it?
It's not. It's 3.4 billion over 3 years. I think it peaks at about 1.8 billion. That's tiny money by the standards of public services. What I've tended to experience in the past, and again, apologies for being hard-bitten and cynical, but a lot of departments will rebadge things they were doing or planning to do already as an efficiency saving, which is part of the reasons we don't do it. I remember once in the past, a nameless department putting forward a proposal that some council wanted a new town hall as an Invest to Save initiative. What was your experience as a Secretary of State in trying to drive efficiency through your departments, David?
Well, I think it was always going to be somewhat mixed. For a long time, I was essentially a spending minister, although not a Secretary of State at HMRC. So I was the Minister for Tax, and in the unusual situation of being both a Treasury Minister and a spending minister. So I needed something of a sort of split personality there. And HMRC was an organisation that was able to drive out some inefficiencies. This was some years after the merger of the Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise, but there was scope there. There was scope through new technology to drive efficiencies. You didn't need as many tax officers as you once had. So it can be done. But if you look at the scale of the civil service as a whole, it has grown again sort of very rapidly. So period after 2010 where you saw the civil service falling, I'm struck by the fact that HMRC is now a bigger organisation than it, in terms of headcount, than it was, I think, when I stopped being the minister responsible for it. Some of that is to do with additional responsibilities as a consequence of Brexit, for example. So we have to do things now that were previously done at a European level. I don't in any way want to malign public servants, and I think it's a cheap shot to do that. But bureaucracies do have a tendency of growing, and I think we've seen some evidence of that, and the government trying to reverse that course as well. So we'll see how that plays out. But it is not an easy process to drive out efficiencies. But you would think, with the arrival of AI, that there must be scope here. And it does struck me, notwithstanding the small size of this transformation fund, that there are opportunities for more public sector innovation, and there are opportunities potentially for private sector entities to sort of point the way and make a contribution in terms of how that can be done. So I think that's certainly something to be looking out for.
I think you raised some really great points there. The first is that the 3.4 billion always sticks in my mind because about 20 years ago, that's almost to a penny the amount of capital that Treasury approved to fund the transformation of IT in the NHS, and the advantages of having electronic patient records so that when people turned up to their appointments, they weren't cancelled because the consultant couldn't find their records, or they weren't a waste of time because the test results weren't available to the clinician. Were just amazing. And the efficiency savings we were promised were quite incredible. 20 years on, there's about 1 in 5 hospital trusts still does not have one of those things. So the promise is huge. The challenge is always how you deliver it. As a former bureaucrat, I actually think it's a fair cop that every year I would always find additional pressures which my teams needed to meet, which required obviously more funding, very loath to offer up any efficiency savings. And I think that's why governments have traditionally, when they're pursuing efficiency agendas, gone for the salami slicing technique of shaving a little bit off everybody's budget. Now, sometimes, as in the early 20s, those slices of salami are actually quite thick, and we're quite trying to reduce them. But it's very hard to get complex bureaucracies to volunteer the information you need to root out where the inefficiency actually is.
Yeah, I think that is right. I think there is also a point which ministers will be wrestling with, which is partly this is to do with risk aversion, partly this is to do with sort of sizes of organisations, that there isn't a huge amount of agility. There isn't the same nimbleness. So you touched upon pilots. A really interesting point, John, about how pilots can be misleading because the people involved in a pilot are very often the most enthusiastic. So that's a fair point. But I'm also struck by the point, you do hear this, that it takes a long while to get pilots up and running in a way that smaller, nimbler organisations are able to do. And then, perhaps there are good reasons for that. You do have to be risk averse when you're delivering public services. You can't have the system fall over. But nonetheless, I think the private sector, for example, has collectively been much quicker to make use of AI than the public sector has. And I'm pretty sure that ministers are going to want to be pushing that as quick as hard as they possibly can. So I think that's one to watch over the next few months. Now we've talked a little bit about the fiscal rules and what might happen when if, I should say, not when, if we get to the autumn and they have been broken. How do you think that debate is going to play out? Is she going to raise taxes? Is she going to cut spending? Is she going to break her rules? What will the Treasury be saying to Chancellor Reeves in October if that's the situation she's in?
Well, it's not a position that any chancellor would want, David, because I think, as you alluded to earlier, public spending is currently pretty close to a post-war high as a share of GDP. It's increased by about 5% national income since before the pandemic, and yet public services, by many accounts, appear broken. Tax revenues are at a post-war high as a share of GDP, and how much we're paying on debt service, as we've said earlier, is now higher than it was in the 1950s when we were paying off the debts of the Second World War. So borrowing's very high, spending's high without people feeling the benefits, and taxes is high. So whichever way she chooses to go, it's going to be a tough choice. The Treasury feels very strongly that the government needs to reassure the markets that it has got a plan, that public debt doesn't increase all the time. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which are particularly acute at the moment. We've got a lot of debt that we need to service, and that's increasingly of short-term maturity, which means I think this year the Treasury is looking to put out something like a couple of $100 billion of debt, which it needs the private sector markets to buy. So we're very acutely tuned to what market sentiment is in terms of buying government debt. And if Rachel Reeves loses their confidence, then we'll see that on an increase in interest rates. And it just takes an increase in interest rates of about 0.5% in terms of medium-term market sentiment before she's bust her fiscal rules. So she'll get caught in a trap. If she loses credibility, it becomes harder to regain that because you're paying higher interest rates on the debt. Could she shift the fiscal rules, if we think that's a thing? I mean, I think that's very difficult. That we're now seeing that as long as debt's coming down at this fixed point in 5 years' time, and without in any way being pejorative amongst a fine body of men and women who've been chancellors, it's quite easy to show public spending restraint in that final year that everybody knows is not going to happen. It's very easy to pencil the indexation of fuel duties in every year, which hasn't happened since 2010. So it's very easy to do a bunch of things to show that it will come down in that final year. And if we think since a year ago, we're still meeting the fiscal rules, but the actual borrowing over the next 5 years is going to be 50 billion higher. So I honestly don't think you can slacken these fiscal rules very much without them being a little bit pointless.
I agree with that, John. I fear some will say there's too much of a Treasury consensus here, but I think that does have to be right. And as I say, there's no sign of debt as a proportion of GDP falling, even without a nasty shock to the system. And there are some potentials for some nasty shocks to the system as well, aren't there? We could see interest rates rising. We could see the OBR coming back and looking at our productivity numbers and saying, actually, we've been far too optimistic in the last few years and we're going to downgrade those. And that's before we get into the issue of trade, President Trump and tariffs. Are we going to be in a situation where trade is going to be very severely disrupted? We might have an international trade war. There's quite a lot to be nervous about.
I think that's right. The OBR has been typically over-optimistic on productivity for a number of years now. That's pretty much where they are now. I mean, I think we said earlier that productivity had grown by about 2% before the financial crisis. It's grown about 0.5% since. The OBR says that for the next 5 years, they're going to roughly split the difference and assume 1%. Now, that's more optimistic than virtually any other forecaster is doing. And I haven't seen a lot of good analysis of why that would be the case. In fact, if productivity increases at the rate it has over the post-pandemic period, it's about 0.3%, then Rachel Reeves will miss her rules by miles. Secondly, you mentioned interest rates. I mean, the primary reason why the OBR concluded she was on course to miss her targets this March was because of a 0.5% increase in interest rate sentiment in the medium term. I mean, we're very vulnerable now because our debt is so huge. We're very vulnerable to changes in interest rates on it. And of course, because of this short-termness of the debt now, that would impact very quickly on new issues. The third and perhaps the most worrying thing is the one you alluded to about the impact of potential trade wars on the world economy. The OBR used the IMF's January forecasts this year. So President Trump had been elected. He hadn't yet taken office. They didn't model any of the impact of his tariffs, which he may or may not introduce. And obviously there's considerable uncertainty at the moment about where they would go. I think it all adds to this feeling that to have a 10 billion margin in 5 years' time in an incredibly uncertain world doesn't feel like a good insurance policy if you've actually set fiscal rules which you say under no circumstances will you break. In practice, pretty much all previous chancellors have changed their fiscal rules when they were starting to constrain their actions. But as we said earlier, it's not that obvious that Rachel Reeves can weaken these anymore before they become a bit pointless.
Yeah, the previous fiscal rules were a bit tighter. They were biting at a different point in terms of the public finances. But yes, I think the US situation is worrying. One level, it's fascinating, but not in a good way. And if you look at, if you like, I think the mindset within the Trump administration, you look at some of the people around President Trump, but not just his own statements, which can not always as consistent as they might be. But there is a sense here that America considers itself to be somewhat of a victim of others, that others are freeloaded in terms of defense, that America struggles with an overvalued currency because it's a reserve currency. You look at the comments made by Stephen Myron, or a paper written by Stephen Myron, who is the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, where he argues that America should use the levers available to it in terms of forcing other countries to do what they want, or tariffs will be imposed, defense support will be withdrawn. And so that might be about intervention in the currency markets, that might be about funding America's defense expenditure, whatever it might be. And it's a very aggressive approach that believes that power is there to be used, that relationships are largely zero-sum games, and that America has found itself being exploited. Now, if there's a complete change in approach, and we are seeing certainly signs of that, that could make it a very different world for businesses elsewhere. And I do think if I was running a business that was vulnerable to this, working out, well, what is it we might want from the UK government? Obviously, we want the UK government to negotiate a zero tariff deal and what have you. But there are particular sectors that will be having to think through that this could be quite disastrous for us. The approach taken by the US government, what do we do to respond? What can the government do to help us through a very difficult period? And I dare say lots of people are giving some thought to that. So I suppose, more generally, what does the government do in terms of providing certainty in an uncertain world? Here, I guess this issue about a lack of fiscal headroom really doesn't help.
I'd actually like to challenge the Trumpian assumption of a zero-sum game. I think
quite right too, John.
America has gained enormous benefits from having an American-led rules-based trading order, which has led to open trade and has led to integration of supply chains across the planet, countries specialising according to their comparative advantage. I think we've all gained from that. I think the lessons of history is that nobody wins a trade war. Some may lose more than others, but I don't think the US is going to win the trade war either. And partly that is, what does business need more than anything else? It wants certainty. If you're going to commit your investor cash now to building supply relationships for the future, to building your customer base, to investing in plant, to training your workers, you want as much certainty as possible that you're going to get a return on that. And if we're moving into a world which is more disruptive, is more uncertain, where there's greater degree of risk, I think there's a significant issue that not only will the transition be disruptive, but that we'll all end up losing out. And this links to your point in terms of our governments, as we saw during the financial crisis, as we saw during COVID, the ultimate insurance policies for their societies. When it all goes wrong, government is the one body which can borrow, really without limit. We say fiscal rules, but unlike anybody else who needs to put their collateral up or their house up to borrow, government can borrow against the future tax generating capacity of the country. So businesses probably will look increasingly to the government to support them. If there's a very difficult transition period in which the UK needs to change its supply chains, which needs to think a little bit more about security of supply, of particular things, where these integrated supply chains we've got in things like motor vehicles, where things are moving rapidly backwards and forwards across boundaries, no longer applies, then we're going to need a whole bunch of transition assistance, where it's to help individual industries make that transition, or workers who are displaced, who will need to be retrained and recouped. So we avoid the situation of the early 1980s, where the labour market is scarred by a generation who remain long-term unemployed. But the bigger risk than that is the one that it's simply, by disrupting everything, reduces our long-term growth. And if there's one thing that links Keir Starmer and Liz Truss, it's that the fundamental problem of the UK economy is not enough economic growth. And none of this will help.
Well, on a link between Keir Starmer and Liz Truss, which I'm not sure either of them will necessarily appreciate all that much. I'm sure both will be tuning in. So Liz, Keir, there you are. You're united in a desire for growth, and rightly so. So, John, many thanks for that. So I think there's a few lessons to take away in terms of where we are. One, not a lot of fiscal headroom, so that does create some uncertainty in an environment where there are lots of risks. I think we've talked a bit about what the implications of a Trump presidency might have. That seems to me to be a topic we might want to return to on another occasion. And there are some scarier scenarios that we haven't really talked about that we could get into there. But when it comes to public spending, considerable pressures, desire for transformation, greater flexibility on the capital budget rather than the current budget, defence and the NHS doing better than other parts of the public sector, and a spending review that is going to be done in a difficult set of circumstances overall. So we'll look forward to June and how that will operate. From a negation perspective, we'll certainly be looking at how entities dealing with the public sector can operate in this environment, how they can optimize the relationship that is good for them, good for the public sector, and good for the public as a whole, try to maximize the value of any of those relationships. There'll certainly be a need to do that all round. But let's leave it there. John, many thanks for your time today, and many thanks to all of you for listening to this Negation podcast. I'm David Gauke. Thank you very much.